My name is Tim Kenny from Tim Kenny Surveying, and this week in this video, I really want to talk about relative humidity. And I'm doing that for three reasons. Firstly, because it's interesting. I think it's a really interesting subject, something we should understand more about, and I really want to record videos and stuff that I find interesting. The second is because we, as a built environment professionals, should have a better understanding of condensation risk and mould and damp and all of these things. We should be doing that anyway, but of course we have all the stuff around AWAB's law, all the kind of increased awareness of the risk around black mould and the health risks and all of these things. So it is, again, a subject that we should know more about. And the third reason is because I saw a post from a really good damp specialist that I follow on LinkedIn, talking about a home survey report that they'd been passed because they were doing some subsequent investigations from it. And in that, the surveyor had kind of reported that they'd taken a relative humidity reading of 67, and as a result, they thought it was a condensation issue. And when I saw that, that kind of really raised a little bit of a red flag for me, and that's kind of why I want to talk about this. So okay, let's start with what is relative humidity. So relative humidity is the total moisture, or the moisture content of air expressed as a percentage of the maximum amount that it can hold. Okay, so we should know that the amount of moisture that a volume of air can hold will change, and that changes because of pressure and it changes because of temperature. Right? That's how we get condensation. If air holding a certain volume of moisture comes into contact with a cold surface, it reduces the temperature of the air and it has to release the moisture. That's a kind of a function of physics, you know. And that's where we get condensation. It leaves it on the surface, and we get the risks that come along with that. As I said, it's affected by air temperature. So the cooler air holds less moisture than warmer air. It's also affected by pressure. So if we're at a high altitude, for example, we're going to have less pressure. That will impact relative humidity than if we were at a low altitude. Obviously, pressure is not one of those factors that changes significantly within or air pressure is not one of those factors that changes significantly within most properties or most buildings. It can to a certain extent, but it's not the major driver of impacts on relative humidity. So kind of for our purposes and for the purposes of this video, we can kind of, to an extent, ignore it. So again, hopefully you're good surveyors. You should all understand what that means and what it's trying to tell us. How do we measure it? Well, there are simple gadgets available to us. We have something like this. So this is a kind of a hygrometer that will tell us, you can probably see a little number there. It's telling me that my room I'm in at the moment, my office is standing at about 60% relative humidity. It does this by obviously reading the kind of moisture levels and understanding temperature and carrying out a calculation. And it can calculate the percentage. We can also use something like this. This is a Tramex MEX5, I think, from memory, which is kind of essentially the kind of electronic moisture meter, step up from the kind of the standard level moisture meter. This is the one I personally use for most of my inspections. It's not a plug for a Tramex. I like this one. I think it's a really good meter, but I'm not necessarily going to plug it. Protometer do a similar one. I think it's the MMS2. It's just not the one that I use. And you can see that if I turn it on, it'll give me some readings there. You might be able to see that clearly. It gives me, again, a relative humidity reading. It can do wall temperatures and air temperatures and all that useful bits and pieces. Right? So we can relatively easily, sorry, my meter's beeping at me now. We can relatively easily measure relative humidity. I mean, this thing, I think this cost me like 15 quid, something like that off Amazon. So really easily available bit of kit. This one, obviously a bit more expensive. It's more expensive than the standard level of moisture meter, but again, not within the realms of, we're not talking thousands, we're talking, a couple hundred quid more than your standard meter. So this stuff is available to us. And one of my key tests for should a surveyor record something, should they measure something, should they take that information, is can they do that relatively easily? Can they do it without equipment, or can they do it using equipment that is cost effective and easily available? And these kind of meet that test. I mean, this is kind of my backup one. It's just a cheapy backup one, and this is my standard meter. These things are available to us as surveyors, and if we're talking about surveyors carrying out non-invasive inspections, whether that be as part of a home survey or a pre-purchase survey, or as part of a kind of a defect specific or a damp specific inspection, this stuff is available to us. So we have the easy facility to collect relative humidity. So we know what it is, and we know we can collect the information. So then we move on to the question of, well, should we? Right? Is it actually useful for us to collect that information? And there are kind of two sides to this. I'll kind of start by saying, yes, I do think it is something that we should be thinking about, we should be collecting, but we also should be understanding it. And there is absolutely no point collecting any bit of information if you do not understand it. And that applies obviously to relative humidity, it applies to moisture meter readings, it applies to, pitches on stairs and roofs, it can apply to wall thicknesses. You know what, if you don't understand it, you don't know what that means, then there's no point having the information, is there? You can't do anything useful with it. And to a certain extent, you're almost better off not collecting it if you don't understand it. Now, of course, you should understand what all of those things mean to be able to describe yourself as a competent surveyor. And I say it's exactly the same with relative humidity. We have to understand what it means, what is good relative humidity and what is bad relative humidity, for want of a better term. As I said, relative humidity will change depending on air temperature and obviously pressure to a lesser extent. But also it will change depending on how much moisture is being produced in a room. We need these three factors: the kind of the level of moisture, the air temperature, and the pressure. Right, they're three variables that will affect relative humidity. And understanding that tells you, you know what? Okay, I've taken this reading now. It's now 57. Right, a few minutes ago it was 60. It's changing all the time. Right? It'll rise and drop depending on what's happening in a space. That's relatively consistent for a space like this. This is my office. It's a reasonable volume of air. It's just me in here producing the moisture from my breath and my cup of tea that's sat on my desk. There's not much else happening. Temperature is staying relatively consistent. Windows are closed, so it's not being ventilated particularly. It's a relatively static environment. But if you compare that to something like a bathroom is going to be subject to much greater changes in relative humidity. Right? We're going to see spikes as people use it, and those spikes will then drop, assuming it is appropriately ventilated. Right? Now, a bedroom will be fairly similar. During the day, going to be relatively lower. At night, that condensation level is going to, the moisture level is going to build up in that space, particularly if it's occupied by two or more people. Breathing during the course of the night, releasing moisture into the air. So that tells us that our one-off reading, yeah, it tells us something, but it just tells us what the relative humidity is in that moment, in that instance. As I said, this is changing all the time. It was at 59, now it's 57, just because it's been sat in a different spot. It is not a definitive answer in itself. It does not tell us everything. We cannot take a one-off relative humidity reading and say, yep, based on that one-off reading, there is a condensation risk in this space, or there is no condensation risk in this space. It does not fully answer the question. It's a bit like getting your moisture meter, taking one reading from a wall and going, you know what, this whole house is damp or this whole house is dry. It doesn't tell you that at all. It just tells you that, tells you what the resistance, the electrical resistance in that one spot is. It doesn't tell you about the whole building. And we're kind of doing the same thing if we just take a one-off relative humidity reading. Right? There is kind of the general opinion is that less than 70 is comfortable. Right? We don't tend to worry about anything under 70. But as I said, that's only a one-off reading. We don't know whether it actually spikes to 80 when people are using that space, or not ventilating it, or not producing moisture in it, or not heating it. All of these different factors. When we carry out our inspections, might only be a property for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours maximum in most cases. I know obviously some big properties will be going back 2 or 3 days in a row, but they're the rarity. Generally speaking, we inspect one off and we produce the best information we can from that. But to actually really understand relative humidity, understand how it is affecting the space, how it is generating whether it is generating a condensation risk or not, you actually need to collect data over time. You need something like a data logger. And these are relatively cheap, cost-effective things now that you can get. And they usually connect to a phone through Bluetooth, or they just log data in other ways. and that can sit in the room. It can measure the relative humidity, how it changes. You can then map those changes against behaviours of occupiers, for example, and see whether they correlate. And obviously, if they don't correlate, then you can establish that it has an external cause of some other form, and you can start to track down those. Right? So that's how you properly use relative humidity. I said it doesn't preclude us taking the readings when we're there, because that reading is still information. It's still information that we can access. If we look, for example, at the joint position statement, the competencies around investigation of moisture in traditional buildings, that tells us we should understand how this kit works, what it does and what it tells us, and we should include some kind of consideration of that information. But we have to consider that information in its true sense. We have to look at it in its true context and accept that actually, you know what, yeah, it is just telling us this one off. Now, of course, yes, if you're, for example, if you're in a roof space and you take a reading and you get a reading of 80 in a roof space, and you're seeing mould kind of, black mould appearing, and you're seeing, mould on people on the stuff they've stored up there, then you know what, yeah, that clarifies to you that you've got a condensation issue up there. But if you go into a bathroom and you take your reading and it's 80, but you're not seeing condensation problems, you're not seeing black mould, that doesn't mean you should be saying, well, yeah, but I got an 80, therefore there must be a condensation risk and they're going to have to increase the ventilation and they're going to have to do X, Y, and Z. Because it could be that literally 2 minutes ago, occupier had a shower, released the moisture, hasn't yet cleared. It is, as I said, it's just one more little bit of information that we bring in. We compare that to everything else we're seeing and base our opinion on that. And that's kind of what struck me about the report that I mentioned right back at the beginning. Surveyor getting a reading of 67, which I would not suggest there's any kind of a problem at just a one-off reading at 67 if I was happy there was nothing else going on. But I certainly also would not base an entire professional opinion on that one reading. I would perhaps say, yes, look, I've taken a reading, it was 67 at the time of inspection. However, relative humidity will change over time depending on occupation and heating and ventilation. And therefore, you may need to consider more longer term monitoring to fully establish the cause of this issue if I wasn't able to connect it to some other option. Now, of course, if I go in there and there's no mechanical extractor fan and there's black mould everywhere and we can see that there's a problem, then you know what? I don't care what the relative humidity is at that point, because I can see the problem. And I think that's kind of what is key for me. Yes, we can kind of record information and we can record data, but it has its limits. And I think that's what we need to understand. And it's the same with moisture meter readings. We think just go, I've got a bit of kit and it tells me something, therefore that must be right. And it's not my opinion, it's what the bit of kit tells me, therefore I can't get it wrong. But it doesn't. It tells you a piece of information. You, as the good, competent professional surveyor, have to interpret that information, understand its limitations, and then use that to provide some form of effective judgment to your client, which then they can, if necessary, take further or not take further, depending on what your best advice and opinion is. So don't discount yourself. Don't over rely on the kit. Exactly the same way we don't over rely on moisture meters, we should not over rely on relative humidity readings from hygrometers. Thank you very much.